prayer, there is no real need to formally go to confession. However, the tradition of the church is that the sacrament of confession, or reconciliation as it is more widely known in this part of the world, is one of the sacraments, the outward signs of an inward grace that's happening in the heart of someone else. So think of it as a little bit of something that you see for a little bit of time. So it could be for a very, very minute period of time that it takes to say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, I have done X, Y, and Z." And the priest says, "God bless you, my child, go in peace, here's your penance, say one Our Father, and you are at peace." And then recites the words of absolution, and it takes a matter of minutes. However, what's going on inside the heart of the person is a whole other story. And that is a much deeper reality that's only known to that person and Jesus in conversation of prayer. The question about whether I need to speak to a priest or not, that follows the tradition of the church. And there's actually psychological reasons why it is good to speak the things that we have done, the sins that we've committed. Because when you speak something out loud, it brings reality to it. It kind of brings you into the real world. I can spend my entire life saying to myself, "Hey, you know what? I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have done this instead." But if I'm not going to actually speak to somebody honestly about what's going on in my heart, then I can rationalize almost anything in some cases. But when I have to sit and say, "You know what? I'm really sorry that I did this because I realize that this has happened as a result of it," there's a reality. There's a sense of real concrete reality that sets in. That's part of the healing that goes on at a deeper level of the psyche than you would understand. So even from a psychological point of view, it's a good thing to be able to speak it out loud. So there are two different traditions that evolved over time in different geographic places in the world throughout the history of the church. And that's where we get the whole practice of reconciliation coming in. First, the practice of one-on-one speaking with a priest about confession, that practice came to be in Ireland. It was the Irish monks who, people would go to the monasteries in search of knowledge, in search of all kinds of research that was common at the time. And they would go to the priest as well to speak about things that were going on, to tell him about problems, to ask him for his advice, and so on and so on. The Irish monks, I love them. They're kind of a little bit relaxed, I'll say, in a sense. But they came up with a whole series of things that people would tell them, sins that they would confess, and their corresponding penances. So there was, in one part of the history of the church, this whole gathering of, if you did this, then here's your penance. If you did this, here's your penance. That's the Irish monks that came up with it, simply from the practice of one-on-one confessions. Meanwhile, while that was going on, over on the mainland, in mainland Europe and in other parts of the world, there was a much more complex situation going on. So, if you came to the church, if you were part of the church, for one thing, and then at some point you decided, you know what, I've committed a major sin, whatever it was, you broke one of the commandments, you would say to the community, I need to ask your forgiveness. And if you did that, then the way that things would be is that you would be physically placed outside of the church. You would not be then allowed to enter the church, to pray with the people, to be part of the Eucharist, until your forgiveness was granted. And that forgiveness wasn't just given overnight. It was because you didn't do this very, very lightheartedly either. Typically, you only did it once in your lifetime. So you would say, I've done this, I've committed this sin. The priest or the bishop or whoever was there would say, fine, thank you, we're going to pray for you. So the whole community would pray for you while you sat at the door of the church and asked for their forgiveness. But you could not enter the church until the end of the Lenten period, when the bishop would come to the door and invite you to come back in and sit at the table, the Eucharistic table. And there was a whole procedure then. So the people had been praying for you all the way through Lent. They would then formally bring you back into the church. The bishop would give you absolution and welcome you back to the church, to the table. And then you would be reunited with the church. And because it was such an elaborate procedure, you didn't want to do this more than once because it was painful. Painful for you to be separated from the rest of the people. But that's where the understanding is when we commit sin, even now, I'm separating myself from the communion of the church. And therefore I need to ask forgiveness, not only of God, but of the community. We don't necessarily throw you out of the door like they would have, but there's still that sense, and that's why it's so difficult for some people to come back to the church as well, because it's not easy to ask for forgiveness. There's a journey that we need to do inside before we can actually voice our request for forgiveness. And so that's why I started by saying what we see on the outside is only a little bit of what's really going on.